Welcome to another session of Ecosystem Engage, the not so daily show. Today I'm joined by two very fascinating individuals, who are going to talk to us today about the importance of value engineering, the impact that we're facing today as a society, as communities, as industry, and as nations, faced with the challenges around supply chain, and what the current pandemic is teaching us in terms of improvements that we should consider, and also what we could expect in the future from a supply chain perspective, and how technologies can play a big role in helping us with that post-pandemic recovery. So welcome, Scott Hunter, the JAPAC lead for the value advisory team at Google. Scott, and we've got Dr. Kaushik Ghatak, who's principal advisor at Ecosystem, not new to the supply chain space. I'll first focus on Scott and just do a quick introduction for Scott, because Scott, you've got a fascinating background. I know you've led a fairly cushy life in the last couple of decades, but it wasn't always like that. You've had a fairly interesting life. You've been a military man. You've been flying helicopters. You've done some fairly fascinating stuff before you decided to take it easy and get into the tech world.
That's true. I did spend 15 years in Saudi Arabia as a logistician and a supply chain manager. And I worked for Booz Allen at the time, and then I finally got into the kind of software industry around 2000. I did a lot of Y2K remediation. I joined a company called I2 Technologies. That's where I got very deep into supply chain. I moved to Oracle, where I was also running part of the supply chain type practice. And then finally I moved over and did about 15 years at SAP, leading their value engineering teams and industry teams here in Asia. I did move over to Microsoft for a couple of years, and now I've joined the value engineering or value advisory team here at Google. So it's been an interesting kind of career, but it's been a lot of fun to watch the change in technology over the years.
That's fantastic. But if I put it in simple terms, you've been making sure for the last few decades that goods get shipped from one place to another and they move around, and it all happens in a very streamlined manner.
You try to, but it's changed quite a little bit from tracking it on a ledger book to now being able to see it in the cloud. So it's been a fabulous journey, and then the whole idea about how technology has changed this is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I would love to get your thoughts. I think there's a lot of learnings you've had along the way. Obviously, as the industry, you've seen different evolutions in the industry. We are in a way at war, as they say, as we hear some of the leaders say in this current pandemic. And you have actually been in war. You've actually been at war before. You have seen what it's like. So I'm sure you've got a really interesting viewpoint that we'd love to hear.
Okay.
Also, just wanted to introduce Kaushik properly. Kaushik, you've been you've been focused on supply chain pretty much through your career as well. Starting off from the as a practitioner on the practitioner side, and then of course in consulting at PwC, and then of course you've worked in Oracle, but for a long period of time you worked with Scott at SAP. So I'm sure you've both got lots of learnings that you've learned along the way together. So we'd love to hear more about that. So
absolutely.
Just to kick it off, we're all three of us. We live in Singapore. I found it really fascinating as we got into this pandemic. Right, biggest concern was, my God, in Singapore we don't actually make any food, and flights have stopped, transport has stopped. The first thought that came to mind was, are we going to have food on our shelves? And we saw for a few days, as different announcements came out, that food started to disappear from the supermarket shelves. Right? And I think there was a sense of panic that people had. But what's been wonderful is to see how well Singapore has coped with it. And you know, I was doing some research and I saw on the Food Security Index that The Economist publishes, Singapore, a country that doesn't actually make much food, we don't really have any produce, not much to talk about anyway, is number one on the Food Security Index. So, you know, before we get into, you know, all the things that we can expect in the future and all the learnings that we have from this pandemic, I'd love to get thoughts from both of you on what has driven that sort of, I guess, really well-planned, structured, seamless supply chains for Singapore that's allowed us to be secure as people living here. Maybe I'll get Scott to go first.
Sure, I'll take a stab at this. First of all, I think the Singapore government is very proactive, and they have actually set down a very good foundation of rules and regulations about food safety, food security, and just the way that they take care of, even when you go to the food court, the cleanliness, etc. The other thing I think has taken place is Singapore, like you've said, they don't grow anything here. They don't make anything here. So they've always had an inbound type supply chain. So I think they've had decades of experience about bringing food into Singapore. And so I think they were much better prepared than some other countries. So I think you start to see just based on the history of Singapore, it's helped them endure this kind of a pandemic. So I think there's a variety of different use cases and ideas about why they're the best in the world, but I do think it has to do a lot with the Singaporean government and how they've actually planned very, very well in their daily lives.
Yep, absolutely. And if I just may add on to that, Scott, I think, you know, the example that you gave, Amit, it is kind of a supply chain resilience 101 that Singapore government has been doing since COVID. So, you know, obviously the usual food sources and the supply sources, there is a chance of them getting compromised for so many different reasons, right? So Singapore has been very proactive in developing alternative sources. And, you know, just a few weeks back, I heard the Industry Minister Chan Chun Sing talking about, you know, developing alternative food source. So which is again, you know, supply chain risk management 101. You have to diversify and you have to look for other possible avenues in case your usual avenues, you know, get disrupted. And also, I'm sure what they're doing is, you know, a lot of Singapore's food, I'm sure, comes from neighboring countries, right? So if they're developing alternative supply sources and from countries, you know, such as New Zealand, let's say, or such as Australia, there are obviously a implication in terms of landed cost because the transportation cost would be higher, and also the food, you know, depending on the type of the food, it needs to be handled differently. So there is a implication from a cost perspective. But most likely what they're doing is they're getting into long-term contracts, and that has a, you know, they're trying to reduce the price pressures based on those long-term contracts with those countries. So, you know, that's what I see. You know, this is supply chain risk management 101, guys, and Singapore is so good at it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I don't know, Kaushik, if you watched it, but I did a session last week, and this food security was one of the topics in that. This is with Her Excellency Joe Tyndall, who's the High Commissioner for New Zealand to Singapore. And as you know, Singapore and New Zealand signed a enhanced partnership treaty last year in May. And as soon as we got into this COVID environment, both the prime ministers proactively reached out to each other, and they actually signed and ensured for Singapore food security and for New Zealand medical supplies guarantee, so that both countries were able to assure each other of, you know, security in areas where they felt that there might be some concerns. So I think it's a great example of how governments can actually step in and drive that level of efficiency and that foresight to make these things take place. But just in terms of, I guess, as we move on to the topic of supply chain, and I know you're itching for it, Kaushik, it's the what are the broader impacts on the supply chain in this current pandemic?
Well, maybe I'll take a stab at this. I think, again, you know, the broadest impact and the biggest impact is the learning of managing risks. A risk element like COVID is obviously very difficult to predict and therefore very difficult to plan for in advance. But most likely, what this pandemic has taught supply chain intensive companies is to have more rigorous process and reviews around their risk management practice. Amit, I have mentioned this earlier. Also, in banks, in insurance, in telecom, which are more regulated, industries, the risk management practices are very mature. They do shock simulations. They try out different scenarios to test the robustness of the system. So what I foresee is most companies, kind of would be trying to develop a more robust risk management understanding, a framework, a mitigation plan, and which will again get reflected in their contracts with their customers and their suppliers. That would be one, I think.
Yeah. The other thing I see is large companies actually help drive some of the standards. So I've done work with Walmart, Carrefour. You start to see how they actually help drive standards into the supply chain and continue to raise the bar so much about the long-term contracts and the visibility in the supply chain. So I think that there's a governmental side about policies and procedures, but I also think there's on the commercial side when these larger channel masters, so to speak, actually start to drive standards into the supply chain.
And so looking ahead, we know that every industry is getting impacted, right? And of course, supply chain impacts and the processes impact multiple industries. What sort of transformations should we expect for a recovery going forward for industries with respect to supply chains? Where do we see digital and technology playing the biggest role in that way forward?
Well, I know technology-wise, a lot of companies are running supply chain software that's 20 years old. And a lot of that was before we were in the cloud type environment, before we applied Industry 4.0 ideas and methodologies. So you would have, we could use to plan the supply chain in small pieces, but you never had the end-to-end visibility because it was not technically possible. It wasn't feasible. Now the price of an IoT device has gone way down. The cost of putting data up in the clouds come way down. So it's become feasible and viable to actually change because of technology. So now we start to see this whole idea about end-to-end supply chain visibility, and I can track and see where I have inventory in a system. I can see exactly when it can be released. I can see where it's at in a port, on what vessel and what container. So I have much more granularity across that value chain. And it allows me to fulfill the expectations of the end customer better. And then it's the same thing about traceability. I can now trace back, because of blockchain or other type of technology, all the way back to the farm to understand what kind of seed that they put in, what kind of fertilizer they put on the field. So you're starting to see some amazing things happen because of the viability of technology and about how IoT devices are connected to everything. And it gives us this beautiful fabric about the end-to-end supply chain. So these are the kinds of things that I think we're going to see as we come out of COVID, because many customers are now ready to change their 20-year-old supply chain software systems to these new systems that run in the cloud. And they all have an AI or an ML engine that runs across the top of them. So you can actually start to see in a real-time basis about how you should shift the product flow in a supply chain. Or if you can see a shortage, you can see how I want to divert inventories from other stocking locations. So it gives you a lot of flexibility that you'd never be able to do before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, we're going to get into the technology piece in more detail, but what you just referred to, Scott, made me think there's a lot of, some of the technologies that you've just shared, they've been around, right, for at least a couple of years now, but there's been inertia for the industry to to work towards it. And I think given the pandemic, and I think it's been a bit of a wake-up call, and my sense is it's all driven by where the market's going to go. And I guess I wanted to get your thoughts, and of course Kaushik's thoughts on the changing consumer behaviors, because they are going to force the industry to shift. It's going to force the industry to rethink some of these areas, right? And so, in terms of, I guess, the impact on some of the key industries, such as the CPG industry, retail, how do we anticipate these industries transforming going forward?
Oh, that's a great question. And what you start to see is, let's take the grocery industry. Over the last few months since COVID started, we're seeing a lot more e-commerce where groceries are being purchased online. And they're actually made more money or more profit in since we've started COVID than they do during a typical holiday season. So the number has increased significantly. So you could just imagine what the grocers have to do, or the CPG industry has to do. They have to have an e-commerce platform. They have to have somebody to pick the item out of the grocery store. They have to have curbside pickup. They have to have curbside delivery of the item. And now you start to see the supply chain velocity pick up. And so you're starting to see the COVID situation has actually driven e-commerce in the e-commerce space of groceries. So I think you'll continue to see that kind of activity as we move on. Online shopping has increased, I don't know how many X, because of you can't go to the store to buy anything. So you buy it online and it's still being delivered. So you see, I think it actually has accelerated that kind of behavior, and the supply chains have to react on it.
No, you're so right, Scott. And you talked about consumer preferences in terms of we as individuals, how our preferences have changed, and some of these habits will continue to remain as we go into the new normal. I just want to touch upon changing customer preferences in the B2B world, which will also kind of drive a lot of increased, adoption of digital technologies. And, it again goes back to this whole quest for variability, right? Because you see, one essential element of managing risk well is to minimize your asset risk and leverage the maximum out of the assets that you actually own, right? So going forward, companies would want to own less assets and make more and more of their expenses variable. So the cloud theme actually goes, falls right in that whole thing. But let me touch upon how this whole need for variable cost structures will probably drive technology adoption. So think of products, right? Think of a company like Tetra Pak. So Tetra Pak is making packaging for fruit juices and all kinds of food products, right? And Tetra Pak is as a methodology and invention in the 1970s. The founder of Tetra Pak, he developed this whole technology, and then for you to use those packaging, you need the machines also. So a consumer products manufacturer, which is manufacturing fruit juices, would buy these whole equipment from Tetra Pak, and they would create these packaging, right? Now, think of it this way: a buying of these equipment is very, very cost intensive, capital cost intensive proposition for a consumer product manufacturer, right? So the more the companies like Tetra Pak, and I'm just giving Tetra Pak as an example because they have been in the forefront of this whole concept called servitization, where what Tetra Pak is doing is they are selling these assets, but they are also attaching, so at a lower value, but also attaching value-added services on a variable basis in terms of better maintenance, in terms of ensuring they're getting into smart contracts, they're getting into outcome-based contracts which will, by telling the customers that, look, you engage us, you give us the data, and we will make sure that your equipment is running 99.99%, almost like a data center contract, right? So in a way, they have made that, a physical product into a service. So the more such servitization happens in, so the need for servitization happens, the more the need for making our products smarter, to make sure that these products are telling us what is happening to them on the ground, so that we can act on them in time, and also we can, so think of lifts. Lyft is another classic case of servitization. These big companies which are selling lifts, they are doing so much more in terms of add-on services from those smart lifts, which are giving them, second-wise operating performance parameters with which they can better maintain the lift, make sure that they never fail. So the more the such servitization, the phenomenon of servitization takes root and it becomes popular, the more and more the need will be to have really strong visibility of what's happening on the ground, not only in terms of your products, but also in terms of the supply chain that is, supporting these products, right? And that's the other area I find very fascinating.
Yeah, Kaushik, I agree with you. I got to do a lot of work with Tetra Pak and with ThyssenKrupp, the elevator company. We also see it now with jet engines with Rolls-Royce,
right?
Where they sell, they don't sell the engines anymore, they sell flight hours. And so you start to see exactly what you're saying, as it's gone from a CapEx to an OpEx, and they collect a tremendous amount of data off of those pieces of equipment. And they've actually opened up new business lines or capabilities because of that. And so anything having to do with collecting the data off of the supply chain somewhere along the line, or off that product, and then they can actually monetize that service. And oftentimes they find that customers don't want to spend a tremendous amount or invest amount CapEx and get it off the balance sheet. They want to look at it a little differently. So I see that over and over again as we kind of move across the supply chain or service type industries.
Yeah, and look, from what you were both saying, I mean, I was just taking a note of it. So, retailers themselves are finding, they're finding themselves at the blunt end of the supply chain, right? I mean, what do you think they would be thinking when it comes to, you used the term earlier, Kaushik, supply chain resilience. What do you think they're thinking about at the moment? What's on their mind?
Retailers are, again, retailers, you have to kind of segment them, right? The brick and mortar retailer versus the e-commerce retailers, the essential retailers versus the non-essential retailers. The challenges for each of them will be very different. But but one theme is again common. Consumers are, it's not because of COVID. Even before that, they have been doing so. They are becoming ever more demanding, and customer experience is absolutely critical for all of these segments of retailers. So whether you're a brick and mortar or whether you're e-commerce, the customer experience of getting into your physical or virtual store and getting that portfolio of products is extremely important. But at the same time, the pressure on increasing the portfolio is increasing, right? So that means that you have to now develop more varied supply sources to provide that set of portfolio differentiation that differentiates you from a customer, right? And there is a pressure on making your supply chain complex. But at the same time, the more complex you make your supply chain, the more the more subject you are to supply chain risks. So they have to balance between the flexibility that they offer and the front end in terms of customer experience vis-a-vis the standardization that they need to have on the upstream in terms of certain maybe certain model standardization, certain feature standardization, and only identifying those attributes that create differentiation to make sure that the cost of supplying to such differentiated customer experience is not hugely high. Otherwise, think of retailers, their margins are so low, they will get killed if the cost of supplying is really high. And I think all the retailers are in some way or the other, are thinking through this thing. Scott, would you, what is your point of view on
Yeah,
this?
so I think you're absolutely right about customer experience, and the customer experience does drive the supply chain. So I can think of in the grocery industry, they're asking people to get back into the kitchen. So I've actually seen grocery stores or larger producer grocery industry come back and say, hey, we want to play a YouTube video about a certain thing we want to have for dinner. Let's say it's spaghetti or something like that. You look at the video, and then once you're through, you can take it and disaggregate it into a shopping list. It's sent to the grocery store. They pick the items. It's for curbside pickup. They pick it back up, and then you get it at home, and they play the rest of the YouTube video about how you build those items or build that meal, which is pretty nice. And then you can rate it and what have you. So you can see where technology is not only increasing the customer experience, it's also tied back to the supply chain or e-commerce, and it comes back, and then the customer gets to enjoy it, after it's been delivered. I see the same thing about. I did something with a kind of a cosmetic company, and you could actually take a picture of your face on the phone or look in the phone, and then women could select the color of eyeshadow, and they could change the eyeshadow to figure out which one they want. It's customer experience. It's a piece of technology that they don't have to go to the store, and it's automatically picked up, and it's seamless going back into the supply chain. So those are kinds of things that you're going to start to see. Customer experience is king right now, and it's got to be seamless, and it's got to be integrated all the way back through to the supply chain. And it used to be, Kaushik, you remember about available to promise. It was a huge calculation. Now it's calculated on the fly. Yep. So this is where I think it's so key to see some of this new technology and how it plays in, but customer experience is key.
So Scott, you just brought me back those memories of for the cosmetic company that we worked on together. Yeah.
Yeah.
that was really cool, and those 7-8 years back. So
yeah.
Very cool stuff.
That explains. So you probably got a lot of free cosmetics, Kaushik. Explains the glow on your face all the time.
I never needed one.
No, but look, obviously I want to get into the technology aspect of it. I know you both look at this from a much broader perspective, and then obviously it links back to technology. But from a technology adoption standpoint, I mean, what should we be expecting in terms of adoption of some of these technologies that Scott talked about earlier? Any thoughts to share on that?
I think part of it has to do with the value chain. And so part of the supply chain will be driven by what value it drives back for the producer or for the end customer. So this is where Kaushik and I share a nice background above and beyond supply chain. It's about the value realization or value management. So we're starting to see a lot of requirements in order to actually build business cases and value propositions as large, retailers or consumer packaged good companies or manufacturers look at the supply chain. Does it make sense? Is it economically viable for us to actually change out the software? Or do we have to change in order to continue to be in business? So I'm seeing this about supply chain resiliency and agility. If they don't change, there's a good chance they could go out of business. So there's a couple different factors that are going on right now in the marketplace. But I think a lot of it has to do with having a good business case and value proposition that kind of justifies the change in technology, because it is expensive to make that shift.
I completely agree, Scott. And the way I see it is, in very simple terms, for the technology buyers, they need to build the right things, right? So there are so many, the complex supply chains, complex value chains, complex organization. Now, how do they decide on what are those right things that will give them maximum bang for the buck, right? And that's what I'm terming it as building the right things. And that becomes a part of the business case that, consideration that Scott talked about. that I need to understand where I need to go, where the gaps are, and therefore decide on what are the right use cases, and therefore then go into the technology evaluation, whether it will be blockchain or it could be IoT based, or it could be AI ML based analytics, and so on, so forth, right? So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is building things right. Once I have decided what, and I'm building the right things, I have to build them right, right? And that's where comes, the evaluation and the choice of the right technology platforms. That's where comes the, evaluation and choice of the right implementation partners, consulting companies, and also the resources that I'm going to deploy. Because if we make any mistakes in building things right and will build them wrong, then we will not get the value, and the promised business case will not be there. And let's assume that we have plugged that gap, and then we have actually implemented. So we have built the right things and we have built them right. Then the other gap we need to close is that we need to adopt them properly. So our people, and that's the whole aspect of change management. That's the whole aspect of driving momentum, and also that's where the business case comes in so useful, because a business case is a motivation for the entire organization to go in this journey. So if you don't have a business case, or if it is not communicated properly, the people on the ground who will make this technology journey a success will not be with you, and then you will not be exploiting the right things that you have chosen and build them right. So I think that's
so Kaushik, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things I start to see is when we were doing a lot of things with ERP systems on the ground, it used to take 3 or 4 years to implement. So oftentimes the business case and the value proposition were put up on the shelf, and it just took a long time to realize.
Right.
Now with cloud, you can actually implement in a much shorter period of time. You can see the results on a real-time basis. You can actually have dashboards that pull those KPIs that you're trying to measure on a real-time basis. And so you're actually can take the business case and watch it come to life over a much shorter period of time. And this is where you also have a chance to go back and reiterate in regards to additional use cases. If it's the right platform, now you have a chance to take it maybe 2 or 3 different iterations in order to continue to drive value out of your platform and supply chain. So it's at a very interesting time, but what we've been witnessing is we were able to build a business case, and then we had to sit and wait to see how the SI implemented it, how the change management was done, how the training was done, to actually start to measure the value. Now we can actually see it in a much shorter period of time, and we can actually start to measure it as soon as they go live.
So I agree. And as the rate of technology adoption grows, there'll be more and more need for making sure that this entire life cycle is managed very well through actual data and through proper business cases and the realization of it. Yeah. So you've got us going, Amit. You have to tell us.
No, I'm just I'm loving the discussions around this whole business value theme, because often I think the biggest challenge, and I think you hit the nail on its head, Kaushik. There's a lot of alternatives out there for end users and tech buyers to consider, and especially we know from our customers, right? And how do they navigate that? It's not a simple question of evaluating just a vendor. You have to build your roadmap. You have to figure out what is that realization you're working towards, and how do you do the value discovery, and then how do you work towards that, setting those goals and setting the goalposts of what you're trying to achieve. But again, I'm probably going to put you both in a little bit of a spot here, and because obviously you have worked with various vendor organizations in the past, and I'm quite familiar with the ERP space myself. The traditional model, and Scott mentioned it, the 3 to 4 year term. Kaushik, you talked about momentum. You used the word momentum. Scott, you shared the 3 or 4 year time frame. That's a lot of time to lose steam and momentum, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of the business case and that realization, sometimes stakeholders change and that process is hard to manage. But in today's context, how do you turn on that with the availability of cloud, right? We're all trying to move towards automation. There's, you both shared earlier the need to have the visibility and traceability, the kind of insights you'd want to get. How do you enable customers to move towards that journey really quickly? How do they evaluate what they need and do it? Is it more discrete? Do they pick it up in discrete pieces, or do they pick it up as a very, as a big chunky piece of work? How do they work towards that automation? How do you get that moving along? Because you can turn this on very quickly, but how can businesses enable that very quickly?
So what I'm watching in the industry today, it used to be driven by the CIO, and the CIO had a portfolio and they kind of knew where they were going to implement. And typically the CIO's roadmap ran 3 to 5 years behind the vision and strategy of the corporation. Now we start to see much more involvement from the CTO and the CDO, and they actually are trying to figure out where does the company need to go to. And so I find that I'm having much more of my conversations with the CTO, CDO, and then we're getting up into the C-suite or the board in order to drive this discussion. And I think it's more important now than ever, because if you don't make the transition, you will die. You will actually go away. And so you start to realize how fast this moves. And when you look at the companies that were $1 billion in assets or revenue, it used to take 20 years to get there. Now you can get to $1 billion in 2 years. You look at Uber, you look at Lyft, you look at some of these unicorns. And so you start to see this massive shift, and people on the board are starting to realize, I have to make a decision, and I have to make a right decision pretty quick. The other thing that's happening here in Asia that I find super exciting is if you look at the Fortune 500, by I think 2030, half of them will go away, and the companies that replace them, more than half of them will be from Asia. So you start to see this massive shift in wealth globally, but the board of directors and the CEOs have got to make this decision to make this shift, and technology is at the center of it. And we're starting to watch more companies become more technology companies than they are the original business. So I'm watching banks become a technology company. I'm watching insurance companies become technology companies in order to ride this wave that they have to go on. If they don't make the shift or the transition, they won't be there. They'll disappear. So I think there's a lot of inertia that's pushing them, momentum that's pushing them to make these decisions. And it's just that how fast this curve's going on, it's almost asymptotic that we start to see this take off. So this is why I find it super exciting about this time in history. And I just think that we'll see more and more changes, and they'll be very quick.
Yep, and Scott, we are also seeing automotive companies become, the technology companies becoming automotive companies, right?
Right.
Tesla being a classic case, right? So with all these electric vehicles, autonomous, we see so many of these internet giants moving into this space, right? So this is really disruptive. Yeah. And the other thing I'll add on to what Scott said was more and more the technology decisions are not taken by the CIOs. During late 90s, early 2000s, our main discussions and the sponsors will be the CIOs, but then CIOs will not have their own budgets. They will borrow the budgets from the business, right? So now the business stakeholders, the line of business leaders, they are making sure that the budget that they are giving for technology is being used to serve them well, because the accountability has become far more. So as more and more business stakeholders get into the decision-making process, the easier it is, but more challenging it is for technology sellers to articulate the business value in their context. But that's the way to go.
Yeah, and look, I think it's so to enable this whole business value theme, it has to tie to the vision, right? And absolutely. I loved your example of Tesla, because if someone had said to me, in the 2000s, that I'm going to go set up a automobile company manufacturing automobiles in the US, my response would have been,
Right.
Man, what have you been smoking, right? And of course, the car was real, and so was the smoke. But yes, it's it was the vision that was actually achieved, and you can see that you can spin industries on their head with technology, right? If you have the right goals, you work towards. So it's been a fascinating conversation with both of you, and I could go on and on, but I know that we've got to come to an end. Any sort of last thoughts that you want to share? Your profound thoughts with our viewers, Kaushik and Scott.
Scott?
I think I would love to come back and do another one of these sessions and talk specifically about the 4 different types of value and then how it actually drives business decisions. And I do think that that's another huge area that we should look at. And then I also think that the rate of change will continue on, the speed of change. And I do think that it'll be a very interesting kind of environment as we kind of emerge from the COVID situation. And I'm super excited to be here in Asia to kind of watch it grow.
Scott, Kaushik and I are going to hold you to that part 2 of this session on those 4 business value points.
I can't wait to come back.
Thank you. And Kaushik,
Yeah. So my I guess a summarizing take would be that, look, the technology disruption is not new. It has been hitting us for the last 8-9 years, but the rate of disruption is going to only go faster post-COVID. And that is why it is very important to get the sequence right. Business first, then technology. Technology enables business, and not so. Unless you have, I'll give an example. So, the actual case of someone coming to me and saying that, look, for a pharmaceutical company, can you help them understand how blockchain can provide them cybersecurity? And I said, no, you're asking the question wrong. The question should not be, how blockchain can help them with cybersecurity. The question is, what kind of information security they need across their value chain, and therefore, and why do they need it, and therefore, what kind of technology options they should evaluate, and blockchain could be one of them.
Yeah.
So just because blockchain is the theme of the day or theme of the year, 2019, doesn't mean that everything has to be led by blockchain. So get the business reasons first. That's the why piece, so important. Then get to the how of how technology will enable it.
Oh, fantastic. Now, Kaushik, Scott, thank you so much. For all our viewers, I've been in conversation with Scott Hunter, who's the leader for the business, the value advisory team at Google for Asia Pacific and Japan, or JAPAC as Google likes to call it, and of course with my colleague and supply chain expert, Dr. Kaushik Ghatak from Ecosystem. It's been a pleasure speaking to you both. We are going to take Scott up and on the offer, and we will do a part 2 focused on the 4 business value themes. So thank you again, gentlemen. Stay safe, stay well, and we look forward to another session soon.
Thank you, Amit, and thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott.